Anybody remember? It was his whole family. His wife and his kids and his doggies and his kitties. And so if you have a problem with that, you need to take it up with the fact that that's how God deals with his people. That's how God dealt with his people in that situation. And that's clearly what Romans 5 is teaching in regards to original sin.
Very good. Thank you. Dr. White, if man is totally depraved, why does God go to the trouble of redeeming him?
Well, we have to define what totally depraved means. I think we've had some real misidentifications. Totally depraved does not mean that you do not respond to God. We believe that we respond to God. We just respond consistently according to our nature. We are the enemies of God. And therefore, for example, Romans chapter 1 says that we are katakanton. We are suppressing the knowledge of God. There's all sorts of different ways of doing that. Some people do that religiously. Some people do that through drugs. Some people do that through riches, sex, etc., etc. But the point is, we're acting consistently according to our nature. And as Jesus said in John chapter 8, anyone who commits sin is the slave of sin. And so you just simply have to answer the question, does the Bible mean what it means or does it not? If you can say that a heart of stone can voluntarily humble itself so as to be taken out, then I don't know what the Bible's talking about, and I don't know why Paul said those who are according to the flesh cannot do what is pleasing to God. I don't know any of that. But when you say, if man's totally depraved, why would God redeem him? Because that's how God glorifies himself. I mean, all our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. The wonder of grace is not that it's given to the humble and to those who separate themselves from the crowd by doing what's right. The wonder of grace is that it's given to people like you and me. I mean, even as believers, think of your own heart, even this day, and yet God has extended his grace to you even this day. God shows himself to be powerful in the salvation of a people that on any other basis are completely unsavable. So why would he save us? What does Ephesians 1 say? All to the praise of his glorious grace. That's the fundamental answer to a lot of questions. And it's a good answer.
Thank you. Professor Flowers, you have 1 minute.
Humble people are no more worthy of being saved than unconditionally elected people. Scripture clearly teaches us the Lord sustains the humble but casts down the wicked to the ground, Psalm 147:6. He mocks proud mockers but shows favor to the humble and oppressed, Proverbs 3:34. Seek the Lord, all you humble of the land. You do what he commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. Matthew 18:4. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Luke 1:52. He has brought down the rulers from their thrones. He has lifted up the humble. I could go on and on. There's 3 pages of verses like this. Humility does not earn righteousness. God gives grace to the humble because he's gracious and he chooses to do so out of grace. Period. It's not meritorious.
Thank you. Professor Flowers, there's several questions regarding calling and the different types of calling. Those called to bring the word, calling to salvation that you were talking about tonight. Can you define the calling specifically again out of Romans 8, 9, specifically 9?
Sure. Again, I think the way you illustrate it is you look at, for example, the parable that I referred to in Matthew 22. And it illustrates the different calls of God for the different purposes of God. He calls some to be his messengers. And notice, all the apostles are from Israel. He calls them from Israel for a reason. Because Israel was chosen for that purpose. That's the promise of God that he made in Genesis 12:3. That I will bless all the families of the earth through your seed. And so he has called a people from Israel to take the message to the rest of the world. That's a part of his calling to deliver his message. That's that first divine calling that I spoke of in my rebuttal. The second is that, it's another unconditional choice that he takes it first to the Jew, but then he sends it to the Gentile. The Jews reject it in a sense, and they, for the most part, they reject their own messengers. And so it goes to everybody. And the text specifically says take it to both those who are good and bad. So it's an unconditional choice to send it to everyone. In other words, don't just go to the rich, or don't just go to the moral people. Don't just go to these people. Go to whoever. And notice he's also calling Paul, for example, he calls out Paul not because, for example, Gamaliel or some other Jew at that time or Pharisee was more moral or less moral. He doesn't call out his messengers because of their morality. He's calling them so that the purpose of God's election will stand. In other words, in order for his promise to be fulfilled in electing Israel, to make sure his message is delivered, because he doesn't break his promise. And so he's going to make sure that happens through Israelites. And so that's the calling he's talking about, to get the word to the world. Now, whoever gets that message, the Ninevites get it from Jonah, who's, in a sense, compelled to go through normative means, big fish, blinding light for Paul, normative means, convince the messengers to go. Convincing the messengers to go through normative means does not prove that those who hear the message, some of them have been elected to get irresistible means to make them believe that message. And I think that's where Calvinists make their mistake.
All right. Dr. White, 1 minute.
I thought that the question was asked, could you explain what calling is in Romans 9? I didn't hear anything about Romans 9, so let me just once again point out to folks, Romans 8:30, those whom he called, these he also justified. The calling, therefore, is the effective call of God unto salvation itself. Then that calling is seen in the elect of God in verse 33 of chapter 8. And then when you trace that through chapter 9, the conclusion then becomes, even we whom he called, not only from amongst Jews, but also among Gentiles. Never has Professor Flowers shown us where that salvific calling to salvation and justification somehow gets shifted so that it's no longer the consistent reading once we get to chapter 9, verse 24. It remains consistent. That doesn't mean that there's not a group of people, all the rest of these things, but if we're looking at Romans 9, it would help to actually go to Romans 9 to see what it says about that particular issue.
All right, thank you. Dr. White, Romans 9, we had several who talked through this being not a very encouraging passage. One specifically asked about their friend who it breaks their heart, who's walked away from the faith. Can you just shortly maybe say how Romans 9 would be encouraging to people?
Well, again, it's encouraging to people who have God's priorities. It's encouraging to people who have God's priorities. It's not encouraging to people who have human priorities. Remember what I said. Remember, look at what is said. In order that I may make known the riches of the glory of my glory upon vessels of mercy. God has a purpose in revealing to us who he is. And the priorities that are laid out in Romans 9 is God demonstrates his power and he makes his wrath known.